Hi, this is David Beckworth, and this is the third and final installment of Stress Testing the Framework, a presentation on the Federal Reserve's review framework process and what can we learn from experience over the past few years and what we should do going forward. Now, there's been two previous installments of this presentation, two separate videos. I encourage you to check those out before you watch this one. The first one, we looked at inflation lessons learned, and there we saw that the public really dislikes inflation, a lesson we relearned. We also saw that there were threshold effects for inflation, and we also saw that the importance of inflation scarring that persists even after inflation expectations come down. In the second presentation, I discussed the framework itself. What is FATE? What were the changes made? And what have been some of the suggestions to improve it in this framework? In this final presentation, I'll take my thoughts on what should be done and what can be done to address the challenges presented in the last two presentations. Now, just to recap what we covered previously in number two, the framework lessons learned, I came up with a list of 7 items or characteristics that a number of people have spoken to as important for the framework review process. Number one, the framework should be robust to a variety of scenarios. It should be able to handle both high inflation and low inflation. FATE, the argument is, was better designed for a low inflation, zero lower bound environment. Number two, the framework should be symmetric. It should not be one that responds only to shortfalls from maximum employment, but deviations on both sides. Number three, it should see through supply shocks. So this is standard fare, but it became difficult during the pandemic. How do you see through supply shocks without inflation expectations becoming unanchored? Well, number four is the answer. You need to have a framework that has a credible nominal anchor. 3 and 4 go together. Look through supply shocks, but do so with a credible nominal anchor. Number five, the framework should include makeup policy. You want to be able to handle zero lower bound environments when needed, and then outside of those, be able to run regular policy. So you need to have some kind of makeup policy built into it in a way that you can use it when it's needed. If you were to encounter a Great Depression or great financial crisis again, you need that tool in your toolkit. Number six, the framework should be easy to communicate. FATE had a number of challenges. What does shortfalls mean to the public? What does makeup of inflation from below but not above target? So there's a lot of uncertainty there, and that makes the policy less credible to the public. And finally, the framework should enhance financial stability. Since our system is highly financialized, you want something that supports that. Otherwise, you're going to create problems. And where we left off in the previous conversation was, well, man, that is an overwhelming task. Is there a framework that can do it all? We showed this picture of Jay Powell. He looks perplexed, rightly so, because either you got to get more complicated, that's at least what many people think, add more bells and whistles, or you go back to simple. Or maybe there's a third path, and I'm going to argue for the third path moving forward. But just to recap what is FATE, let's go back to your previous slide that we saw. And this is a slide that outlined the reaction function or the Taylor rules for flexible average inflation targeting. Now, I have here also the FIT, the traditional Taylor rule of the flexible inflation target. And then we looked at the second one where we added unique terms. We added an inflation gap where you have the FATE inflation target, and we had this output gap where you only respond to shortages, or if it's employment, only shortfalls from maximum employment. So what's next? Where do we go? And again, I want to avoid going to the what I call the two ditches, giving up and going back to real basic and not having some of the 7 elements I talked about, like makeup policy, symmetric, and all that good stuff. But I also don't want to get so complicated that we lose sight of what it is. It becomes hard to communicate and deal with some other challenges. So I have a proposal. It's pretty straightforward. If you've been following my work, you're not going to be surprised what it is. And this is it. Nominal GDP level targeting. It can do all 7 of those things. It can do it in a simple, straightforward way. And it's something that I think the Fed is implicitly inching towards anyways. Jim Bullard has said many times that FATE, which was, again, the big change in 2020, was actually a step towards this. So what is nominal GDP level targeting? Well, let me explain to you what it would be in terms of an equation and get to maybe more intuitive discussion. So in terms of a reaction function, you'd simply have an interest rate rule that were to respond to deviations of nominal GDP from its level target or its growth path target. Now, that target could change over time slowly as potential real GDP changes. That's a conversation for another time. I have an entire paper that deals with many of the concerns about nominal GDP targeting. Provide a link to those in the show page. But let's provide a more intuitive discussion. What is nominal GDP targeting? So one way to think about it is total dollar spending. So you would target the total dollar spending in the economy, and you would target some growth rate for that. And again, I'm advocating a growth path or level target, not just a growth rate target. So you would be targeting a certain value. The economy would grow over time, the dollar size. Now, for every dollar spent, there's a dollar earned. So this can equivalently be called targeting total dollar income. In fact, 1980s, 1990s, this was called nominal income targeting. But over the last few decades, a more popular formulation is nominal GDP targeting. Now, that's not a very catchy term, and were the Fed to adopt it, they might want to try a different language. But it's a very intuitive idea. Stabilize the total dollar spending. Let me illustrate how this would work. And let's begin by thinking about the concern about supply shocks. To illustrate the challenge of supply shocks and how a nominal GDP target would handle it, imagine the US economy is at a size of $25 trillion dollars, and currently the Fed is targeting a 4% nominal GDP target. Now, as an aside here, when a central bank targets a nominal GDP measure of 4%, implicitly there's an inflation target embedded in it because there's a potential real GDP component, say 2% here, and that implies a 2% inflation. So real GDP growth plus inflation gives you nominal GDP growth. So a 4% nominal GDP target would imply a 2% inflation target. And since potential real GDP changes slowly over time, it's easy to anchor it around whatever your desired inflation target would be over the medium run. So target nominal GDP, you get thrown in a medium inflation rate target to boot. So great 2-for-1 deal. Now, if you're targeting 4% GDP growth on a $25 trillion economy, that's going to give you $1 trillion in nominal GDP growth. So in other words, the $25 trillion economy is going to grow to a $26 trillion economy. The question is, how does that additional $1 trillion growth in the size of the economy, how does it get allocated between real economic activity, real goods and services versus higher prices? And that's where it's useful to look at supply shocks and what it will do to that balance. But let's begin with a case where there are no supply shocks. Again, we're targeting 4% given potential real GDP of 2%. That means real GDP would grow at 2%. And so $500 billion or $500 billion would be spent on real goods and services. The other 2% of nominal GDP or the other 500 billion would be spent simply on higher prices. Add those up for a total of 4% growth in nominal GDP or 4% growth in the dollar size of the economy, which in real dollar terms would be $1 trillion. Now, let's say there's a negative supply shock. We have a pandemic, we have disruption from trade. Real GDP is going to be adversely affected. In this case, the $1 trillion, less of it will be allocated to real goods and services. In fact, previously we mentioned it'd be 500 billion or half a trillion. That's going to come down. It's going to come down to $250 billion. So real GDP falls to 1% because it's negative supply shock. Now I'm just picking this value to illustrate it, but any value that's lower than 2% would do. But to keep it simple, we say real GDP falls to 1%, which means of the $1 trillion being added to the economy, only 250 billion of it is being spent on new goods and services. The other $750 billion of it is being spent on higher prices caused by the supply shock and the existing inflation target. So 3% now of the 4% is going to higher prices, and 1% is to real GDP. Now, here's the beautiful thing is all the Fed does is focus on 4% nominal GDP, 4% total dollar spending. And it allows this breakdown to occur naturally. It doesn't have to itself determine where it goes because it just creates the dollars, and how the dollars get allocated is based on the supply shock. Now, the flip side is true as well. What if there's a positive supply shock? So let's say now AI innovation leads to a sudden surge in real growth. In this case, real GDP will be higher. Now, we're going to assume potential real GDP doesn't change for the time being, but so it's a temporary increase in real GDP. Again, targeting 4%, what we find is that real GDP goes to 3%. Again, any number higher than 2 just to illustrate this, but we'll say 3%. And now 750 billion of the 1 trillion is allocated to real goods and services. So now those dollars, same dollars, are being allocated more towards real goods and services. We are truly better off, while fewer dollars are being allocated to inflation. Inflation has gone down. Again, these shocks are occurring. The Fed is not concerned about what's happening to inflation over the short term. Inflation can go from 2% to 3% down to 1%. And if this is truly a shock, so it's going to be distributed both above and below, and over time they offset each other, you're going to have 2% on average. Now, one thing that we've done in this example is we're assuming the Fed perfectly hits 4% nominal GDP. Now, it may be the case that something happens, there's a financial crisis, or fiscal policy goes and does something that pushes it above or below. What happens in that case? Well, in that case, that's where it's essential to note that we're aiming for a growth path or level target. We will make up for past misses both above and below, and this will be where it meets that makeup policy and also the symmetric part of the 7 ideal list of a framework review. So let's move to a case where we see deviations from 4%. Let's begin first with a baseline case where the Fed does hit 4% every year. We start off with 25 trillion. We grow to 26 in year 2, and if we grow 5 more years, so in year 6, we'll be at 30 trillion. Well, 30.42. Now, to see this graphically, we can see this blue line here in this chart. It shows 4% growth. We're on target. Wonderful world. And again, we could have that straight line, but within that, real GDP could be going up, could be going down based on shocks. But again, the Fed does not care. It just keeps the dollar size of the economy at 4%, and it grows a little over $5 trillion over these 5 years. All right, so let's now go to a case where something happens and nominal GDP or the dollar size does not stay up with 4%. It actually falls below. Financial crisis, overly tight fiscal policy, something happens. So let's say in year 3, the dollar size of the economy contracts 1%. Nominal GDP falls 1%. Well, the next year, since there's makeup policy, it has to make up for it. You'll see in year 4, the rapid growth of 9.25% restores the dollar size back to 28.12 trillion, which is what it would have been had there been no recession. So the dollar size changes in year 3 below where it should be, but then it makes up for it in year 4. And what would that look like graphically? If we take a look at this graphically, we would see that there's a decline in year 3, and then there's makeup growth where it grows much more rapidly than 4%. As we saw, it grows 9.25%. And so we're back on the growth path. Now let's consider a case where we grow too rapidly. Fiscal policy is too accommodative. So in year 3 now, we actually grow at 8%. Well, that means in year 4, we're going to grow a whole lot less in order to get the dollar size of the economy back on track. So again, we grow at just the right level, which is 0.15%, very short of the 4%, but it restores the dollar size to the appropriate path and leaves the ultimate dollar trajectory on the desired target. Graphically, it looked like this. We grew too fast. We slow down the growth. We get back to where we should be. This is a nominal GDP level target or a growth path target. So you can see that the dollar size stays on the targeted growth path over time. Now that we know what nominal GDP level targeting is, or growth path targeting is, let's go back to that list of 7 ideal characteristics and see if nominal GDP level targeting meets them. So number 1, we wanted a framework that is robust to a variety of scenarios. Well, nominal GDP targeting stabilizes aggregate demand, and it corrects if it's too high or too low. FATE, the issue was, can it deal with inflation that's too high when there's too much aggregate demand pressure? What nominal GDP targeting does, it cuts to the chase and says, let's stabilize demand in the first place and not respond to the symptom itself. So it does so both with a deflationary or inflationary environment, but it does so by stabilizing aggregate demand. The first goal is met. The second objective is to have a framework that is symmetric. Well, we see that a nominal GDP level target is also symmetric. It responds both below and above. And again, it's very simple. It's not some complicated notion of maximum employment. It's just simply aiming to hit a 4% growth path target. Now, over time, the Fed may have to update based on changes in projected potential real GDP. But again, those change gradually. That should be manageable. So it's both symmetric, it's robust to a variety of scenarios. It is also able to see through supply shocks, another check mark for nominal GDP level targeting. We demonstrated this earlier, but just to reiterate, a nominal GDP level target is only concerned about stabilizing the dollar size of the economy. It wants it to grow $1 trillion a year, at least in this example that I used. And by doing that, it allows the Fed not to worry about what's causing the temporary deviations in inflation. During the pandemic, there was this big debate about, is inflation transitory? Is it permanent? Another way of saying this is inflation caused by supply shocks or demand shocks? And what this does, it allows the Fed not to worry over the short run changes in inflation. Now, over the medium to long run, you bet the Fed gets to think about its inflation target because, as I mentioned, there's an implicit inflation target embedded in that 4% nominal GDP target. A nominal GDP target is also a credible nominal anchor. By definition, it's stabilizing the dollar size of the economy. Again, check for nominal GDP. It's also easy to do makeup policy with it, as we demonstrated. You simply grow the dollar size faster or you slow the growth down. And this leads us to the next question. Nominal GDP targeting actually is easy to communicate. Now, we talked about the challenges with fate. It's hard for the public to know what's a shortfall. It's hard for the public to understand make it from below. But if you frame nominal GDP targeting in terms of a nominal income target, you tell the public, hey, we're here to stabilize total dollar incomes. Again, it's an average. Your individual income might be different, but we're here to stabilize total dollar incomes. That's very accessible, very um, easy to understand for the public in terms of what the Fed's doing. You can argue stabilizing inflation is something that the public didn't understand at first and maybe still gets confused because they got gas prices they look at. So selling this as an objective that stabilizes total dollar incomes, I think makes it easier for the Fed to communicate. Finally, nominal GDP targeting also enhances financial stability. Now, this should be fairly intuitive at the level that most financial contracts are in dollar terms. If you stabilize people's households' dollar incomes, they'll be able to meet their financial obligations. So, for all these reasons, I think a nominal GDP level target is really what the Fed wants. They may not know it, but deep down, that's what they're inching their way to. They're kind of getting there, groping in the dark, so to speak, towards something like a nominal GDP level target. And I think that's ideally where the Fed would go. Now, realistically, I know the Fed's not going to get there. They're not going to be waving a flag in front of the Eccles building with Jay Powell with a big smile on his face. However, I do think the Federal Reserve could use nominal GDP level targeting as a benchmark framework. This is what nominal GDP level targeting is, what it does, what it provides. How do the changes we're making to fate get us closer to that? So, in my ideal world, recognizing that we're not going to jump into the deep end of the pool of nominal GDP level targeting, my hope, my aspiration is that the FOMC will move fate closer to a nominal GDP level targeting framework. Now, we'll provide links on the page where this video is found to documents that provide further explanation. I also encourage you to go check out the Mercatus Policy Brief series we put out for the framework review. All these things will shed more light on nominal GDP level targeting. Thank you for hanging in with me through these 3 video clips, and I appreciate your time and encouragement. Take care.